Hello and welcome to another edition of Razorwire. Today I am back with Oliver and Richard to discuss the cybersecurity market, or at least our predictions in the cybersecurity / information security market for 2025. We're going to be talking about all kinds of things, the consolidation that seems to be occurring in the market, what our thoughts are on that, the direction that the market is going from an AI perspective, from products, services, consultancy, and indeed legislation, with some key legislations coming in, obviously at the beginning of next year in the form of DORA. So without further ado, let me introduce my guests. And as usual, to analyse the market, look at where the predictions are going for 2025, and all things of what is going on within the cybersecurity market. Who else could I have? Who else could I have guesting on here other than Richard and Oliver? Coming back once more to tell me exactly where this bloody market's going, because it's really confusing at the moment. Oliver, Richard, thank you ever so much for coming back. Do you want to introduce yourselves? Everybody knows who you are now. You're kind of co-hosts here at this moment in time, but go for it. Go for it, Richard. Who are you?
I'm your co-host now, to be fair. Yeah, Richard Cassidy. I'm a CISO for a large resilience and cyber recovery business, and been in this game now for, 25 years. I shouldn't really be counting, but I am. So pleasure to be back and looking forward to the discussion.
And obviously we have Oliver as well. Oliver, do you want to tell the people out there who you are?
I work with a number of different vendors in the moment as an independent industry analyst and advisor. And so the spaces which I'm really focused on are security operations, security data fabric. You'll hear a lot around in AI SecOps. So those are the markets where I have a pretty good feel on what's going on over the next 12 months. Yeah.
So what is going on in the next 12 months? We're going into the Christmas period. This is a time of reflection as to the year gone and the year to go. So who wants to start? Where are we at the moment?
There's a lot of diversification in the market, right? So there's a couple of emerging markets, security data fabric, which I mentioned, which is essentially it's like data pipelines. There's a lot going on around security data lakes. There's a lot going on around detection and response, whether it's identity, cloud detection and response. And I think these are all really exciting things, but people are talking about a market consolidation. And if you ask me, and we'll talk about this, I think, in detail, I'm seeing exactly the opposite. I think at the top in traditional technologies, but there's this huge proliferation of emerging technologies at the bottom, which I find incredibly interesting. I've written about it before. I call it the Cambrian explosion in cybersecurity. There's this phase back in the 350 million years ago or so, when we just saw this massive diversification of body shapes. Most of them didn't make it. That's the interesting thing. This blank canvas, people experimented. And of course, you can imagine over the next 2 to 3 years, some of these things are going to stick. Some of them aren't. Just like we've seen in the past, where SOAR has now been declared obsolete as a standalone technology. That's something that happened this year by Gartner, right, in the hype cycle. So that's also interesting that we're trying things out and not everything is working out.
Well, I didn't last long, SOAR, did it? Anyway, Richard, what are you?
I've got some of my own views, but I always ask a lot of the sort of C-level suite that I meet, what are your top priorities for next year? What are you focusing on? And I get some interesting ones. I think the common one that I've heard now in the last 3 to 4 months is that a lot of the C-level people I'm speaking to see they're hoping for, I don't think they're going to see it, but a consolidation of regulation. And the reason this is interesting is because I think we're over-regulating and we're making it very difficult for businesses to innovate in terms of trying to build the outcomes that regulation wants to build, because there's so many overlapping regulations. So this was one prediction that a lot of the CISOs I'm speaking to say is something that they will be pushing the agenda on, through the various channels they have access to. And I think I said this previously, that a group of CISOs wrote to the G20 summit, the OECD member states, writing a letter crying out for some level of sanity on regulatory releases, because it's just getting to the point where businesses are struggling. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure now in industry to look at that. So that's always number one for some reason, the regulation pain. Keep hearing this, but I've seen enough vendors in the last couple of months now to know that it possibly has some legs. That the whole quantum encryption stuff, and I'm going to say stuff because it's a vast subject, will finally be productized next year. There's an interesting company out of the US that I spoke to only 3 weeks ago that have a very interesting product that does actually work, and it's exciting because it means that organizations are going to start to be able to implement this capability in quantum cyber warfare, as it were, and we can dissect that in a moment, of course. My final prediction, if there's a top three, and there's loads more, is I spend a lot of time watching what adversaries are doing with the tools I have. Right, I'm not an absolute pro expert in this field, but I do maintain a level of connection to that side of the fence, as it were. And I think we're going to see AI-powered hacktivism is what I'm going to call it. Hacktivism 2.0, where you're going to start seeing a lot of autonomous AI systems that are created by activist groups, initiating very complex multi-vector cyber campaigns and targeting specifically governments and corporations as well. So this will be interesting, and we are seeing some interesting things there at the moment, and that will lead to other outcomes as well, of course, because what the attacker does, the defender has to respond to. But there you go. I'd say that they would be the top three. The third one is more me. The first two is what I'm hearing consistently in my conversations.
It's interesting with the regulation thing because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we do virtual CISO for a number of firms, and just trying to figure out what you have to do nowadays to meet legislative detail. It's just getting really difficult. You have to have GRC tools now to figure out that what you're implementing facilitates which regulation, which compliance item, be it PCI DSS. Obviously, we've got DORA incoming, we've got NIS2 incoming. We've got a lot of changes that are occurring in the market with technology, and obviously, the whole AI discussions that are going on about how we secure that, and is that going to be secured separately and differently from the way that it's just a crazy, crazy market. I'm seeing a lot of vendors popping out of the woodwork, lots from Israel. Oh, wow. I mean, but I'm also seeing significant rises in costs now for tools and for solutions. We're seeing some of the renewals that we're getting on key technologies, specifically if they're coming from the States, seem to be rising quite dramatically. And in some cases, I mean, really dramatically, to the point where you sit there and look at the quote and think, shit, really? There also seems to be a lot of consolidation in the consulting space at this moment in time. There's a lot of firms being bought out. A lot of friends of mine who run information security firms are just, every week I'm seeing another, these guys have been bought, these guys have been bought, these guys have been bought. And when you look at it, a lot of it is coming from the States. Where do you think this is all kind of leading? Because vendors are popping up all over the place. They're increasing prices quite dramatically. We've got distressed economics across the globe at the moment, or at least in the Western world, which is driving up the cost. We've got our own government who are driving up the cost of even employing people for organizations, which is really causing difficulties because we're all going to have to raise prices and the customers aren't going to like it. And we're going to have to raise prices quite a bit. But when you have the US market also coming over, who are used to double the day rate for consultancy that we charge in the UK and in Europe, it's going to get really interesting. It's going to get really tough as well, I think, for a lot of the end customers like yourself, Richard, for instance, going out and getting support, for instance, for PCI, if you ever went down that route, obviously. It's going to increase the cost quite substantially. And the cost is already quite high from a UK viewpoint. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Richard, from CISO on the floor? You're buying products and what have you. Are you seeing that yourself, or have I just given you some horrible preemptive information?
No, the thing is, IDC talked about this in their predictions for this year at the end of last year, which was that CIOs and CISOs are going to be in the top three. I think it was number two. I'm trying to find the data, so I'm absolutely spot on, but I'm sure it was number two in the top three. That CIOs would focus on consolidation of their technology or services stack, and there would be pressure put on the vendors to deliver. The age-old adage, right? You buy 100% of the platform or product and use 20% of this capability, and that is something that I have actively seen, not just internally, sort of with Rubrik, but also from my external conversations. A lot of CIOs, CISOs doing. They're going back to the vendors. They're making sure that they're getting the value that they should be getting out of it. If they're not, they're realigning contracts or deciding maybe to consolidate through other technology stacks. Because Oliver raised a good point with certain technologies kind of becoming obsolete. That is the start of this wave, which will only gain momentum in 2025. In that we're going to look and say, do we really need these capabilities? Or what's the variation in this platform versus that platform? Can I actually do what I'm doing with the existing tool sets? So this consolidation piece is absolutely spot on. It's happening and it's going to gain momentum. And I think the CISOs, at least I feel in a good position, because vendors are realizing that the market has changed and that we are putting more pressure on them to make sure we get the value for our spend. And if we're not getting it, then let's renegotiate, because thank goodness most of us are consuming things, right? Consumption economics as a service, so we can turn up or down the dials. But absolutely, that is a trend which is going to take front and center stage in terms of technology spend and utilization in 25. So I couldn't agree more.
Oliver, you raised your eyebrows in some of that. Go on. What are your thoughts?
So there's several things to untangle here. And so on the regulation, I'd love for you to in a minute, when I'm done, Richard, to think about like, how can you fix this? Because you say the CISOs, which regulation? National, international, industry? Because that's not clear to me how you can fix this when there's no central body in charge of all of these. And the OECD piqued my interest because I did research with a professor from ETH Zurich. So that went into the OECD vulnerability treatment program. So I kind of know a little bit around what they're doing there. But that's not their remit, even though we were talking about a globalized bug bounty program. That's what we were pushing with the OECD. On the AI, we should talk about that at the end, because there are developments in agentic and AI, which I'll be honest with you, probably make it look like 2025 isn't going to be that year for a variety of different reasons. But I think that's something closer. But on the market, on the consolidation, look, there are a number of different vendors at the top who are putting together bigger portfolios. That's what they are. They're not platforms. They're not well integrated. They are portfolios. We've had two waves of this before. The last wave was 2015, 2016, RSA, EMC, McAfee, Symantec. Nothing fundamentally has changed today, except for the belief that you can usher all of the customers onto the cloud, which isn't really happening to that degree. And that top cluster of companies is actually more around a dozen to 20. This is not consolidated to 4 or 5. Many of those will be falling off the way, as we've already seen. It's hard to maintain that momentum. Look at the CrowdStrike incident just recently. You have to be excellent across all areas, and complexity hits everyone equally. But most of all, it's not as easy to integrate all of these things as people believe. And you still have a specialization. Palo Alto is a network shop. That's what they are, right? So if you're an endpoint person, you're not going to go to Palo. That's essentially, I think, so which are threat drivers are acting against consolidation. I did a 3-part article series explaining why I don't think consolidation is actually happening. It's just happening in legacy technologies. But emerging technologies have actually proliferated and are going to grow. What's happening in the market is that there's this middle segment of startups or vendors who are trying to get a Series B or Series C funding, and they're overvalued from the last low interest headache. And I think that's going to be something we're going to see play out next year. You're going to see some companies you thought were a fixture in the market actually quietly disappear because they're unable to get additional funding. And instead, investors, and why do I think this? The VC model works primarily that for the first 5 years of a fund's existence, the VCs get 2% of the fund. After that, 1%. The remainder of the money get stuck into the companies in 2 waves. The first 5 years, you get new companies. After the second 5, you reinvest in those. VCs are not reinvesting that second 5 years. They're giving the money back or starting new funds, because why would you stick more money into an overvalued company? And so there's definitely something brewing there. And indeed, there's some fire sales going on. There's some backrooms deals going on and so on. So I think that's going to have an impact on that as well. And so how much of the consolidation is actually, because I've heard from a lot of CISOs, they'd like to consolidate. That doesn't make it a practical reality, that you can meet those RFPs and requirements in every single case. So I think while there's a desire to do it, the market might not be quite there yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, let's tackle the regulation one first then.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, right, there's regional nuance regs, and you're right, some of those are just too specific, and they are what they are. I'm talking more about the regional specific ones, so those that specifically focus on the EU or North America with the SEC. I mean, look at this year, right? NIS2 and DORA, huge overlap in both of those regulations. And why on earth do we have a market where we've got a regulation that's hyper-focused on finance and one that isn't? It doesn't make sense to me. We all have the same cybersecurity problems. And to all intents and purposes, I think DORA is a much more effective regulation for recoverability, right? Getting back to operational capability quickly than NIS2 is, genuinely, hand on heart, having looked at both in detail. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that to the industry? Come on, let's make everybody as resilient and as capable around their security posture as possible. There too, immediately we could consolidate into one framework, for example. And the SEC, right? All of the SEC regulations, I say all of them, that's a broad statement. I mean, a number of them overlap very, very closely with a lot of what we're seeing in the EU. And then you've got the UK doing its own thing, and there's overlaps there with the PRA. And I get it. There are regional-specific nuances, and there's specific laws and ways of doing business that have to be mapped. But actually, if you look at the PRA versus DORA, oh my goodness, there's so much overlap. And the problem is, for me, I guess it's not the regulations so much, it's the way they're being enforced. Because as a CISO now, I've got to be able to open the door to the ESAs for DORA, and then the regulators within the Bank of England for CBEST and PRA, and then and it goes on and on and on. Why can't I just meet an overarching ability that allows these auditors to access the data in a way that doesn't cause me multiple pain and extra spend that I really shouldn't be spending because of the overlap? So that was what I was referring to when I talked about regulation.
Yeah, there's a question. So there's a solution there where the regulators could collaborate better to make sure that they're more equivalency, right? Or there's also a solution where you could have a tool which tries to, I guess, translate between them. What would a solution look like there?
Yeah, and this is it. It's almost like that orchestration layer, because of those commonalities, GDPR, PIPL, CCPA. There's a lot of commonalities that we can translate into the various regional nuances. So I guess what I'm asking the regulators to do, and what I'm hearing from other conversations is, can we just have an interface that allows me to go and meet the regulations? But first of all, let's consolidate where it makes sense. And NIS2 and DORA and PRA is a good example of that. But where I can't consolidate, give me the ability to be able to respond in a more cost-effective, more timely manner than I am today. So I think it is that orchestration capability. And here you go. There's an idea for a new platform or product. But I think that's where it sits. It's in communicating it to the multiple entities. Because it's the technology stack that delivers the outcomes as well as the people and process. I'm not downplaying that. And so if I look at again NIS2 and DORA and a few others, I'm using the same technologies to tick the boxes, right? And the same will be for your PCI world, and that's what I'm saying. I just need a way to orchestrate the outcomes to the regulators. I think that's what we really are talking about here.
But I'm confused here. Like, didn't GRC and integrated risk management solutions solve this?
Yes. Well, that's what their promise was, but we're not there.
I had a discussion recently with someone about SIM with exactly the same. They were adamant SIM did all of these things, and I said, no, it doesn't in reality.
I think what annoys me with this market is there's a lot of confusion from outsiders to how things work in security. Nothing works the same in any company that you walk into. Everything's slightly different. There's cultural differences. There's technical differences. There's people differences. There's regulation differences. How do you pull all of that together into something that could be a coherent security strategy, defense in depth stack, and something that works without making it horribly expensive? And then you throw on, the new requirements around, informing a regulator when you have an incident, the moment you have it. It's like, well, it doesn't work that way. You don't suddenly find out and tell the regulator. You kind of find out normally a little bit after it's happened, when the damage has already been done, And the problem, I'm a QSA. I have been for many, many years. I've dealt with ISO. I've dealt with all kinds of different regulations over the years. And I'm looking at DORA and NIS2 and all the usual stuff, and HIPAA and blah, blah, blah. And orchestrating all of that together in something coherent kind of takes a bit away from, and maybe Richard could tell me I'm wrong on this one, from actually doing what you're there to do as a CISO. You're so worried about this, that regulation, that informing this other body, blah, blah, blah. You're spending more time doing that than you are actually securing the bloody business, helping protect the customers, protect the people, protect the shareholders, and then you have the sword of Damocles over your head saying, well, if you screw up, then it's going to be on your head. Because I think a lot of CISOs are worried about the implications going forward, about what happens when there are security incidents. We've always been pointed at in the past and said, well, you didn't secure us enough. That's why we had the incident. They forget that they might have turned around and said, no, we accept all of this risk because we don't want to spend any money on security and we don't care about it. We don't see the risk. And I see a lot of this regulation coming out because companies haven't been taking it seriously. And then on the top of it, you have, well, the C-suite will potentially, end up coming a bit of a cropper if they don't consider security. But then the C-suite don't want, as I've seen so far, a lot of CISOs on the board. So it's like, well, how are the CISOs going to do anything if you don't put them at the right level to be able to advise you at least? They don't have to be in control. Just let them advise you. Give them the remit to be able to do what they need to do. They don't sit under IT. They don't sit under operations. They're their own thing, in my view, and maybe it's wrong. Information security is there to protect the organization from external threats and internal threats, and potentially from itself, from making some really dumb decisions. Software development companies that go live with massive vulnerabilities within their code because they've got to get it out, because if they don't get it out, someone's gonna get shot. So they bypass security people entirely for doing things like the pen testing and the vulnerability scanning. And that market's changing dramatically now, because it's not enough anymore to just do one annual pen test. You have to do more, which is very expensive. The proliferation of continuous pen testing, shameless plug there for Razor's Edge. But, that's also starting to proliferate. And with things like DORA requiring good quality threat intelligence, not just on your technology, but also onto your kind of people aspect. There seems to be a big rise. I don't know, Oliver, if you've seen, there's a big rise in human intelligence companies as well.
Really? What on earth? I haven't heard of that, to be fair. But what's that?
It's basically where people are analysing, the activities of the people within the organisation. And risking and ranking them and risk ranking them based off of what their activities are with the technology.
Inside of threat monitoring, basically inside of threat monitoring, right? Indeed, it's a funny thing because I worked at a UEBA vendor for a while, and they were sometimes mistaken for that, especially by activists. Because you could, if you were really nefarious, you could kind of use it but it is worrying that we have an uptick in these kind of things, that people basically, that's a security component. I don't know how prevalent the insider threat actually is. Some people say it's really high, other people say it's really low. It might depend a little bit on the culture within the company,
There's people maliciously doing things, and then there's people doing things because they're stupid and they take stupid risks and they win stupid prizes. Richard, I'll hand over to you because you're from a similar background to me, and am I talking utter crap or?
No. So actually, interestingly, so it's partly insider threat, Oliver, but it's actually extended. And I was blown away. I was at the Gartner Risk Summit earlier this year, and a lady comes along from a very large airline manufacturer. I'm going to stop there. And she talked to me about 5 pillars of innovation. And one of the pillars was cyber psychology. Now, I've studied psychology, so it's a great subject. I love it. And I said, whoa. What do you mean cyber psychology? Take me on that journey. And to your point, James, she said, within the constructs of the EU AI Act, okay, so that's another conversation, but we are building systems using automation tools, machine learning analysis, yada, to predict where users could benefit from either higher controls on access to the environment and or training outcomes based upon their risk profile as it changes day to day.
Yeah.
And I thought that's okay. You just got to be careful you don't fall foul of psychological profiling within, the AI controls around the EU AI Act. But I like that kind of dynamic trust dial approach to users' behavior, right? So, if I'm that user that just clicks on links, and we are kind of talking insider threat, but it's more of a day-by-day behaviors view on it. If I'm that gung-ho person that likes to just open every email I get, I don't give it a second thought, and the systems are seeing that, then they should be reacting by controlling some of the things I maybe have access to in that particular time frame. Or, if I'm a user that is consistently running applications or systems or accessing websites or external resources that maybe could be potentially risky, then there should be notifications to me, not just in, hey, you should be considering this from a security perspective, but hey, why don't you go and jump on this 5-minute sort of enablement discussion about X, right? So I get a little bit more of an insight as to why that behavior is risky, and hopefully that will change behavior. So it's insider threat, but with more of a real-time, I say real-time, insider threat can be real-time with the analysis of the data, but it's that behavior. What can I do to better enable the user than just controlling their access? It's also about the education. And that was something that this airline manufacturer are actively doing. And I said, okay, that's interesting. I didn't think we'd get there yet, but we were there.
Just very quickly, I mean, do you see the threat actor landscape changing? Because, I mean, and it's kind of controversial, but it's not controversial. I'm probably going to get cancelled for this one. I'm not a political person. I'm not going to get involved in politics, be it social politics or be it politics. But, there's a lot of groups now, a lot of young groups with a lot of young people who are very unhappy with the way the world is being run. They've gone and thrown things on, paintings in, buildings, they've glued themselves to infrastructure. Is it not the possibility that in the near future, some of them are going to figure out that if they're going to do some damage and potentially, do what they feel that they should be doing, that they're just going to join those organizations and do that anyway? I mean, we've always talked about insider threat, but I do feel, especially now that, I mean, let's look at it this way. It's getting pretty hairy in the world, really, isn't it? There's a lot of people arguing with a lot of other people, nation states arguing against nation states. The cyber warfare side of things is going a bit crazy, and everybody's tooling up, and as information security professionals, if you work in a business critical area, oil and gas, power, water reclamation, any of these kind of things that obviously NIS2 is covering, you are going to see a significant change in your threat landscape, and you're going to have to really start considering additional threats that requires additional technology, additional measures, and so on and so forth. Is that something that you think is going to happen, or am I taking crazy pills?
I think what you're asking there is, are we just seeing a change in the mind and state of the younger generation? We don't need to be specific, but certainly younger than we are. Their propensity to want to be more disruptive, both from a hacktivism perspective or general cyber threat. That's what I've heard? Because I want to be specific on the question.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. It's a great question, right? And I've been reading a lot about this over the past while, because again, I just like to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on there. So research does indicate a notable shift in the psychology of young individuals, right? And that's leading to, let me be specific because that's a broad statement. What we're talking about is leading to increased engagement in activism, in hacktivism, and then what we would probably call cyber hacking, right? And so there's a couple of key factors here. Media is the number one factor, right? For me, without a shadow of a doubt, right? Media does influence in terms of the mindset of the younger generation and the identification with the romance or whatever it is with hacking and this side of the world. And so what we're seeing is a lot of media outlets sort of shaping young people's perceptions and intentions. In fact, there was a study published. Oh my goodness, I've got to get this right in my mind. There's a cyber psychology, and it was called Journal of Psychological Research in Cyberspace, and that found that individuals who identify with like this hacking kind of persona are more likely to perceive the benefits of hacking than the risks, right? So that they're not going to weigh the risks up there, and that increases their willingness to engage. And my goodness, we've seen a lot of the news around this particular subject, and it does look fairly sensational to a lot of people. And then you've got to consider the backgrounds of some of the people that get involved. And I think we had a podcast on this a couple of years ago, James, where we talked about those coming from less fortunate backgrounds. And I'm not talking about poor countries. It can be anywhere. It can be the UK is a poor country in places at the moment. But there are people that are turning to this because it's an easier, more interesting thing to get involved in. And so that's the first thing. The second is the rise of this hacktivism. And let's stop oil and all these other groups, but let's talk about digital. So this hacktivism, is an easy way to get your point across. It's become a very prominent method for young people to express political and social dissent. And so this form of digital protest, it's easy to learn how to do it these days. There's automation tools that will even do some of the stuff for you. And there's been a study done on this as well, which kind of predicted where we are today. But I think the final point, because I could talk about this for absolutely hours, the kind of psychological motivations behind these activities. And if you understand why young people engage in hacking and hacktivism, it's really crucial. And those factors are at a very high level, right? The desire for recognition, that's not changed. I mean, Oliver will remember, I hope, and I do as well. I got involved in that side of the fence when I was a teenager because it was interesting and it was a cool thing to do at the time. Luckily, back then, we weren't looking to be disruptive and steal money, but that hasn't changed. People still want recognition, and there's a desire for that. But it's also the thrill-seeking aspect of it, right? And this ideological commitment to play sort of significant roles as part of a team, to feel be part of something bigger than you are. And there's, again, a really good article in the Journal of Strategic Security, which examines these motivations. And if Taylor and Francis online is where you should go to read that, which talks about what's the process, is how do people get involved and what's the steps they go through to almost be. And it's not radicalization into hacking, but it's this molding them into this hacktivist framework, and in a way that's from their couch, from the perceived safety of their bedroom or wherever their computers may lie. But we well know that it isn't as safe as they think it is. So I think hacktivism is becoming a huge problem, and it's why I mentioned it in my top three. I know I said AI is going to be sort of automating a lot of it. Yeah, you can say yes or no. I mean, and there's no way to prove it, but hacktivism itself is certainly going to be a big challenge in the coming years.
It's interesting. The first reports I ever came across warning about this were around 2002. MOD and DOD published one in 2004. That's how long they were talking about the increase of domestic and internal terrorism due to climate change and so on. However, if you kind of look at it, I don't think they're actually very active on the net for good reasons. They're Luddites, right? It's like the Unabomber. He lived in a hut in the woods. But at the same time, there's an increase in political activism. If we look at people who organize, whether left, right, I don't want to judge it. Like I don't belong to either tribe, but they're both pretty motivated and active and digitally versed. I think the counterpoints to that are simply that we've had a high phase of hacktivism about 10 years ago. I think in the meantime, it's actually subsided a little bit. Not that it doesn't mean to say it can't go back up again, but I feel subjectively QAnon used to be far more active than they are now. At the same time, we talk about digital natives, but they aren't really more technical. They're app users. They don't understand how stuff works behind the stuff. They're not necessarily better at hacking. There's good data and studies coming out showing that actually digital natives aren't more technical. They're just used to using more apps. And I think that's an interesting thing. A user is not someone who commands the internet. Yeah, and so, but that can change, right? And the AI thing is interesting because you mentioned the AI thing, because I think you're right. AI is going to be used as a tool to teach them skills, which right now, they're very readily available. It's the automation bit where I think I'd love to have another discussion in a minute if we still have a bit of time around that, because there's some news updates I'd love to share there. Yeah, but the activism, I think it's going to be one of the increased ones. But I see more a matter of ideologies battling it out, and society being the collateral damage in the battlefield, rather than necessarily someone like who's really motivated by climate or something. I think we have other ways of acting,
I mean, we can move over to the automation thing for the last part. I think my last statement on this one, really, on this whole thing, when it comes to kind of regulation and what have you, is, I do support regulation to make sure that, companies are doing what they need to do to protect the general public, to protect the services that they provide, and to check to protect the shareholders and the people within the business as well. But the problem I have with some legislation, let's look at cyber essentials. It's either so broad you can't really apply it in all instances, or it's so tight and so focused, like PCI, for instance, that companies find it difficult to apply it and still innovate. And it's something that you mentioned earlier on, Richard. You can't secure an environment so far that you can't do anything in it. You can't not secure it so it just gets whack-a-mole. Us as information security professionals have to find the right way to do it. And I really would like to see regulations that supports that, risk-based approaches that allow, saying you must do this, you must have encryption, you must have, VPNs that terminate in the Netherlands or whatever, just really strict regs saying, look, build your strategy and we will evaluate if we do random audits on you, like with PCI. Well, it's not random with PCI, it's yearly, where you're actually looking at, the strategy. What's the strategy of the CISO? Is it well defined? Does it cover all reasonable pertinent points? There's always going to be things that you miss, but we've got to be adaptable. We can't be, you're a square peg and there is a square hole. Well, the company's not square. You're forcing me to do something that I can't do, because there's restrictions around doing that, because we need to innovate, which moves us strictly into, wonderfully into AI. I mean, I see it as well. We've had this discussion before. We've already figured out that I'm the first one that's going to get Neuralink shoved into his head and then start, interacting with technology. We've already established that Oliver likes his biology and doesn't think it's going to happen, and Richard's going to join the singularity when it happens. We've established that in previous really interesting arguments. I'm looking forward to artificial intelligence becoming an advisor and allowing me to make decision making faster, allowing me to feasibly get it to kind of make changes, but authorized changes only, not on the fly making its own decisions, and supplying me with the information that I need in order to do the job that I do, which is advise organizations, undertake CISOs as a service, my guys doing audits, that kind of stuff, to help us filter through all of the crap that we get, so we can laser focus, or focus at least, on specific areas. I'm really looking forward to AI. I'm really looking forward to, automation, as long as it's not too automated. We've still got to, be able to make that decisions.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I find it interesting because I read a lot of papers on this. Right? I have my newsletter. I cover this, and my perception.
A very good newsletter.
Yeah, thank you. And my perception is the following: I see all these diagrams, agentic framework, and in the middle, there's always this MacGuffin. It's a magic box that magically knows how to do shit. It doesn't exist yet. Okay, we all use the foundation models. We're waiting on the foundation models to improve. When an investor comes to me with their automation tool now, I say, come back when OpenAI have a new model. Because that's the actual place we're at. When people talk about automating it fully autonomous, I've had feedback from multiple teams who were trying to do that. they've pedaled back from the idea. It's not reliable enough. The last training runs from the big companies have all failed. They have not yielded big breakthroughs. The people in charge there going out saying, well, it doesn't mean to say scaling laws don't apply anymore. We just need to scale it higher. They're hoping now that $1 trillion scaling run, training run is going to basically move the needle again. Honestly, that's where we're at on that side of the thingy. People trying to build nuclear power stations. Microsoft have bought 3 Mile Island. You remember nuclear accident, 3 Mile Island? Yeah. They've kind of hit a wall because they have to prove that it's viable. Amazon's efforts have been scuppered by bees, rare bees, I kid you not. Of all things, they can't, their new data center has to stop building because of rare bees. Because this is physics and geology, not just code, right? And so all of these things are probably solvable. We might be able to get another training run, but there are AI experts already saying that this is it. We need to start looking at another methodology to get past the limits to this. And I think that's a pertinent point. It's great what we've built. It's amazing. It is not able to fully automate this kind of stuff. And if you do it from an attack perspective, it is not stealthy at all. It's a brute force tool. And so it's okay in a lab, which is where people are using it. Actually moving stuff into production is much harder. And the one example I can tell you is Moody's. Amazon have them as a example user. They've built like an agentic system, but Moody's have been building big data platforms to do data analysis forever. They're not your typical user there, I would say. How much scaffolding do you have to add to make this work? And I've got good feedback from multiple teams. At that point, you're basically building a sim in reverse, just trying to check what the LLM is putting out. And so there are limits to this. We are all relying on those foundation models to have another breakthrough. The last year haven't yielded many, you know? So I'd be cautious, is what I'm saying. If it's predicated on that moving forward, the question is, what can we do with what we have now? That's the bigger question. What can we do with what's available, you know? Yeah. So that's the lay of the land right now. But hey, they might have another breakthrough in 6 months. Who knows?
Go, Richard. I can see it in your eyes.
Look, necessity is the mother of all innovation, and so AI is being used at the moment realistically well, if in my travels, for regulation. It's inevitability. If you're not going to give us the tools, and these GRC platforms don't cut the mustard, then we're going to find a way to do it. So we did, and so fine-tune models that are very easy to use in the framework of regulation. It's black and white answers. It is or it isn't.
Yes.
A lot of organizations, especially the big banks, and that's across the world, are turning to AI there, which is great. And Oliver will love this and hate it, but there was an article on Popular Mechanics. It was just released about 5 days ago, where it's predicting we're 6 years away from the singularity, Oliver.
They're not predicting. Somebody is telling you. It's not a prediction, because predictions should have some kind of scientific basis. It should be based on data.
There is. I'll share the article with you. There's scientific basis and time to edit.
But what you mentioned, the GRC problem is a text problem, not a decision problem. And so we mustn't conflate these things. AI isn't AI. It's good for very specific use cases, and people are just extrapolating to things it right now can't do.
Large language models can be applied to regulation, and it is being done successfully. I've seen it with my own hands.
Problem. But it's a text problem. That's what it is. Not a decision intelligence problem.
No, exactly. For those that are listening to the podcast, all that is essentially doing is, using tokenization and LLMs and vector databases to go figure out where the data sits and then structure it in a way that you can bring back to the regulator. It saves you a hell of a lot of time. Yes, you still need to validate the output, to Oliver's point, but my goodness, you're saving yourself a significant amount of time in getting the data points, because traditional reporting tools don't cut it. They just don't, especially with all these regulations we've got. And then singularity is a bit of a laugh, but it's time to edit. It's based around LLMs and stuff, but it's a bit of a funny article, but it's interesting nonetheless. But I think, James, the final point, to come back to is this consolidation piece. I get it. Oliver believes it's maybe not entirely possible depending on what's going on, but all of these events I've been to this year, we've all been there, right? RSA, Oliver, early in the year for you. I've been at InfoSec and various other major vendor events. It still blows my mind that we're all still very isolated in this industry. Palo Alto's doing its own thing, CrowdStrike's doing its own thing, Fortinet, the list goes on. I just feel organizations don't want these siloed approaches anymore. They need vendors to, and of course that doesn't solve the vendor problem. The vendors want to sell technology and services, so they're not going to want to, integrate or talk about that game too well because they don't dilute their own value. But that's where the customers have to go and push back and say, right, I've got all these technology stacks. Let's just do a matrix analysis of where the overlaps are. Let's align that to the regulation requirements, because that's probably why I bought most of these. And then let's start to either turn up the dials and features and functions on one product and down on the other, or remove others entirely. I genuinely, I am seeing that process occurring. And in 2025, these vendors are going to get their feet held to the fire on this. They're going to get a lot more questions about what's the value. Do I really need this platform? Can I get it elsewhere? And that's just a fact of what's happening, regardless of whether we like it or not. It is occurring.
It is occurring, but my argument is that the customer base is so diverse that no single vendor is going to be able to capture a critical mass. This is a market demographic thing. It doesn't matter what users want. Vendors are not going to cut into their own flesh and open up their platform and make themselves basically replaceable by a competitor, just like the customers don't in their own industries. It's not like everyone else is doing this exactly where they're playing, is it? So isn't it unrealistic to ask that of cybersecurity companies?
Yeah, it is a tricky one to quantify. You're right, because there's so many competing agendas on this. But the sentiment of what I'm saying is that where organizations have gone and invested in technology stacks and service stacks, and they've probably done it with a broad stroke approach because they've been forced into regulatory corners and they've just had to get boxes ticked. And Oliver, you and I have been through this cycle so many times when we worked in vendors. People will just buy because they've got to meet a requirement. And they won't necessarily go into the level of detail and overlap analysis that they should do. But now they are. We're seeing the overlap analysis happening. And that's what I mean by the consolidation. It's turning off things or reducing license costs in existing platforms, but they've already got them through incumbents or whatever it may be. That's the consolidation. It's feature consolidation, not so much technology.
And you're right. I mean, and the last time this occurred, what end users did is they tried to consolidate the number of vendors they were buying with. And they did that. And 2 to 3 years later, when they found that a lot of the things that they consolidated just weren't fit for purpose, the trend went the other way. Because ultimately, you're trying to replace best of breed for a consolidated approach. And the consolidated approach has to have synergies which derive something which is greater than the sum has to be greater than the parts. That's hard to execute beyond a certain few key technologies. And I think so, despite all us wanting this, and it makes complete sense why we want it, I don't think it's actually that easy to do in practice, especially because the requirements across industries now are actually diverging. They're not really converging. If you think of like a manufacturing company with segmented networks versus a insurance company with end users, they have a very different set of requirements. They're going to go to different vendors, different platforms, different ecosystems,
James, I think there's a podcast on that subject. How do you do it? I've got some ideas, and I feel it is feasible. And I'd love to be back with Oliver to hash this one out, because I think people want to hear about this. How do I go on that journey? Is it possible? Where is it possible? I think it's a good subject.
Absolutely. Drop me an email and we'll cover it.
Yeah, because I'd summarize. So you're on an individual organizational basis, there's a portfolio consolidation. But on a market basis, it's not necessarily consolidating the market, is how I mean it, I think, because of the divergence in requirements. But you're right, we should do an episode on this, because for some customers, it makes sense, and for others, it doesn't. And the question is, how much do you consolidate? What's an optimum amount of consolidation where you don't suffer from not getting best of breed? So I think it would be an awesome topic, yeah.
We'll definitely have to cover that. But our time has gone. We could talk about this all day long. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we were talking about it before we even got on camera. I think, we'll probably end up having another conversation about it in the early part of the new year as well, because we'll have other stuff that will come up over this Christmas period. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Richard, for your insight as always. it's really, really good to sit down and talk about these things. And I know a lot of our listeners, some of our highest lists, sort of like views have been on these types of conversations, because I think there's a lot of people wondering out there, where's the market going for security? What's it going to wind up looking like? There's so much to it, and it's changing so quickly. It's important that we have these conversations, and I'm definitely going to be going to a lot more shows next year. Probably with the little portable camera. I'm going to be meeting up with various different people and seeing what their opinions are on it as well. So to all of you out there who are listening or watching, thank you ever so much for coming and sitting in and listening to our podcast. It's always great to cover these topics. If you've got anything you want us to cover, or you think we've missed something, or you want to come and have an argument with us over something we have said, my producer's always telling us we need more arguments here because we tend to agree a lot, then please feel free to reach out through direct messaging, LinkedIn. There's plenty of different ways that you can get through to us. And we will be seeing you again soon for a number of other topics. See you soon.
And thank you for listening or even watching the latest edition of Razorwire. It's always good to get feedback. Please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us via LinkedIn or through our website, www.razorthorn.com. If you feel that there's something that we should cover maybe a little bit more in depth, a new topic, or something of interest to you or the community at large, we'll even do interviews. If you've got any recommendations or you want us to interview people, we'll reach out to those individuals and see if we can get them on camera so we can ask them the important questions about InfoSec. So it'd be great to see what your feedback is. In addition, I do have a book recently come out, the Cyber Sentinels Handbook, a primer for information security professionals. Now, this book is very much geared up towards professionals at all levels of their career, be they starters, be they newcomers, be they people who've been in it for a little while and maybe looking for a little bit more direction, albeit the older ones looking to maybe reground themselves in some of the more important aspects of the trade that maybe they've forgotten over time. I've had lots of good feedback from a lot of different readers of lots of different levels, so please feel free to get yourselves a copy. We've got the e-copy, we've also got the paperback copy, and if you don't want to spend any money, you can go on Kindle Unlimited and read the book for free there as well. So thank you ever so much again. Look after yourselves, and we'll be seeing you again soon.